Victorian State Government recently announced that it will host the 2026 Commonwealth Games. There will be 16 sports with the usual range that we're used to seeing, athletics and swimming, plus others such as squash, volleyball and table tennis. However, shooting is not included. We know it wasn't included in this year's Birmingham Commonwealth Games either. But given that shooting is one of the most substantial components of the Games, this strikes us as being a political decision. It's even more political when you consider that shooting was part of the 2006 program, which was also under a Victorian Labor government. In fact, here are some photos from when shooting was announced to be part of those Games by the then Victorian Sports Minister, Justin Madden. So what's changed? Both governments are Labor and both made announcements of Commonwealth Games in Victoria. The difference is that the state's Premier is Daniel Andrews. He's the socialist leader who has shown a complete disregard for the shooting sports, both directly and with contempt for shooters, along with his police minister, Lisa Neville. We wrote to Dan Andrews asking why shooting was dropped. While he hasn't responded, he'll no doubt point to Commonwealth Games Australia, which is the Australian body responsible for organising sports in the Commonwealth Games. However, as you'll see, they don't make the decision alone. At the same time, we wrote to their president, Ben Houston, asking what his explanation of this was. It's complex, but the short version of the response is that a number of other sports, including shooting, are listed as core sports, which may be included later on. But the Games hosts, which means the Victorian government, get a say in what sports are and are not included. There will be further sports added to the program by the end of Phase 2, which happens to be after this year's Victorian state election, and that we should speak with Shooting Australia, which organises the shooting events for the Commonwealth Games, and is a member of Commonwealth Games Australia. However, the response also said that discussions on Phase 2 are strictly confidential, which means Shooting Australia won't be able to tell us, even if they know. In fact, Shooting Australia cannot be political, but we can. With the announcement being made after the election, we can't afford to let the government exclude shooting, which is why we'll be taking this into account as we approach this year's Victorian state election. Until shooting has been included, we can only assume Andrews, who heads the Games host, which is the state of Victoria, wants shooting left out for his own political reasons. In fact, with a federal election now only weeks away, we've decided, like West Australia, shooters need to send a message to the Andrews Labor government by, with one exception, voting against Labor federally in Victoria. More information on what else we'll be doing at the federal election can be seen in the next part of this episode.
Do you run a business that supports the shooting industry? Take out a gold, silver or bronze sponsorship with the NSC to get your logo on our videos.
Guns are mostly a state issue, but the federal government makes a lot of noise about the fact it's responsible for the National Firearms Agreement, so we'll hold them to it. There's a lot in this for shooters in West Australia, who are up against a tyrannical state Labor government which needs to feel the heat from their federal Labor counterparts. So we're recommending shooters in that state vote against Labor. It's similar in Victoria, where we're recommending shooters vote against Labor to send a message to the Victorian Labor government over not only their treatment of shooting in the Commonwealth Games, but with other changes they've been making to gun laws in that state. The only exception here is in the seat of Latrobe, which we'll explain shortly. Outside of those states, our voting advice is to put the major parties, Labor and the Liberal National Coalition, towards the bottom of your ballot papers. We also believe there are politicians from both parties that shooters should specifically ditch. They include Labor's Jason Clare in Western Sydney and the Liberals' Jason Falinski in Macalla, which takes in Avalon Beach, Mona Vale and Wheeler Heights just north of Sydney. And we definitely recommend that shooters in the seat of McPherson, which takes in the area around Coolangatta and Burleigh Heads in Queensland, vote against the Liberals' Karen Andrews. And shooters who live in Latrobe, which takes in the Victoria area of Berwick to Pakenham, vote against the Liberals' Jason Wood. The reason we're recommending shooters vote against Karen Andrews in Queensland and Jason Wood in Victoria is because they are responsible for making the National Firearms Agreement the pain in the backside that it is for shooters. In fact, Karen Andrews, while she's in a safe seat, has consistently refused to explain why the NFA has appearance laws. Her response to the NSC about this made it clear that appearance laws are in the National Firearms Agreement because of 3 instances that involve the use of replicas. However, those instances were conduct cases that were already illegal, and one of those instances wasn't even in Australia. The pro-shooting parties contesting the election who we recommend are in this order: Liberal Democrats, Great Australia, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Australian Federation, and Katter's Australian Party. If you find them on your ballot papers, then please vote for them above the major parties. And make sure you put the Greens last. Remember, you can put in a postal vote or vote early at an early voting centre. You'll find that information at the Australian Electoral Commission's website. As we get close to the election date, the NSC will highlight any individual pro-shooting candidates if and as they may arise, so stay tuned. This federal election will be one of the most important elections shooters have had over the past 30 years, so please vote wisely to make your vote really count to ensure the future of our sport.